Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week, we are once again commemorating Black August, a month of celebration and study of the Black liberation struggle that kind of grew especially out of the actions of the Black Panthers and other Black liberation struggles of the 1960s. And so this week, I would like to focus on sort of a pivotal moment that I think is greatly misunderstood about sort of the U.S. imperial system. And that is the period of the late 1960s leading into the 1970s and the rise of neoliberalism. I'd like to also generally talk about sort of the economics of racial oppression in the U.S. And understand like what the real economic root of that is, that it wasn't just driven by sort of a personal or just a social bias, but in fact that the social bias, the personal racist element of it and the societal racist element of it was driven in large part or exacerbated in large part by the economic systems that required at first primitive accumulation of wealth, and then later on, I say required, within this capitalist system, the capitalist system itself required a mass incarceration in order to sustain itself, to sustain its exploitation. So to talk about specifically this kind of a period, late 1960s and leading into the 1970s, we're joined by Eugene Puryear. Eugene is the author of Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America, as well as the host of Breakthrough News. Thank you very much, Eugene, for returning to the show.
Brianna, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Can you give us sort of a brief rundown of why exactly in this sort of particular moment, we're talking about the 60s and 70s here, why in this particular moment the capitalist state sort of re-geared itself toward this mass incarceration that many people call the prison industrial complex?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think the easiest way to summarize it is that the state was facing challenges. The capitalist class was facing challenges in a way that rocked it to its core. And I think there's a couple elements to it. I mean, one element to it is sort of the ideological roots, as they were, of mass incarceration, which certainly had roots deeper than the 60s and the 70s, but relevant to that moment. Because in the context of the mass upsurge of the Black liberation movement, which of course, was the maybe sort of central driving force, not maybe it was, of this broader, very radical and in many ways revolutionary upsurge sweeping the country, one of the strategies of containment that was latched onto by the Nixon administration and other reactionaries was an attempt to use the issue of quote unquote crime and to link crime to radicalism. Now, I say quote unquote crime, and this is always the tricky thing when this is being discussed because so many of these terms are so loaded in so many different ways. And I think, there's many things that are quote unquote crimes that aren't, and many things that are that, just sort of go unmentioned. But, using sort of the conventional framing, what was starting to happen in the late 1960s and the early 1970s were increases in some categories of crime related to a number of things: the social fallout of the Vietnam War, the beginning of economic problems, and this sort of long-term, in many ways, the denouement, sort of the long-term effects of the hardcore oppressed Black communities in the North post-World War II coming to a head in terms of economic and social issues. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on that because I think, and many criminologists will, and they'll say, well, crime was rising in the 60s and into the 70s. And, obviously, objectively, that is true. But again, just like today, when we break down the categories of these things, I think it looks different than the way it's seen. So, I don't want to give credence to that, but I do want to at least contextualize it for people. And not only contextualize it, but understand why people reacted to it and how people reacted to it. Because in the early 1970s, for instance, the entire sort of rhetoric of the Black community from left to right was very focused around issues of crime. And certainly the Black Liberation Army and other groups like that put a big premium on, what's the best way to put this? Criticizing drug dealers and other forces in the community. People can look that up in the history of that. But obviously many of the famous, slogans that came out at that time, capitalism plus dope equals genocide being the number one element of it. But you also had a right-wing element of that as well, coming, from elements of the community pushing for quote unquote law and order. So anyway, I say that to say that one of the strategy of the Nixon administration was to try to link the two issues and to say that because radical movements like the Black Panthers were making a mockery of the law, it was creating an atmosphere of lawlessness. And that was the sort of basis and the backbone of quote unquote rising crime. And so you have this strong ideological offensive that's really aimed at containing the most radical elements of the Black community, who are aggressively challenging the state and inspiring people around the country and around the world to increase their own level of commitment and level of radicalism. And so by trying to essentially tar it with the brush of the broad brush of quote unquote criminality, you have that element of it. And because of the issues of the clashes with the state, you also had a major push to militarize the police more heavily. The Law Enforcement Administration Act is passed during the Nixon administration, I believe it's 1970, starts to funnel huge sums of money, billions of dollars into funding local police agencies, SWAT teams, which emerged at the same time, the paramilitary units, radical movements are also used as the excuse for that. So, I say all that because even though this precedes mass incarceration, it's a very important part of the ideological narrative that sort of builds towards mass incarceration and really, represents a strong shift in terms of the move and the focus on law and order. Not that law and order politics are new to America, but in the context of how social problems are being addressed, there's less of an approach that was more akin to the economic, what some people call Keynesianism. We could debate that, but, sort of the economic focus New Deal on Great Society, Lyndon Johnson, which acknowledges some flaws in the capitalist system and seeks to address social problems from the point of view of making different adjustments here and there, as opposed to just brute force, which is ultimately where we get to. So I want to just put that aside. I think, fundamentally and more importantly to the issue of mass incarceration is the rapid acceleration, what I said before, the deterioration of the hardcore oppressed communities, the rapid acceleration of just the complete destruction of the so-called inner city. Again, all these loaded terms all over the place and how the histories are relayed to us. And maybe an interesting commentary on the use of knowledge as a propaganda tool when everyone only knows how to refer to something one way. Then even when you're trying to break it down, you got to use their phrases to figure it out. But that's another interview. More fundamentally is the economic acceleration. And this is, directly related, and I lay this out in the book. I mean, I think everyone knows that you go into business to make a profit. So the one thing you start to see in the 70s across the entire capitalist world is the margins of the profit are going down. And so there's a lot to that, but ultimately the response of the capitalist class is what is now often referred to as the global race to the bottom. First the runaway shops to the south, then into Latin America, into Asia, searching for the cheapest possible labor, the globalization of the supply chain, the massive attacks on unions in this country, and the increased precariousness of work and attack on the rights of workers. All of that, coming in train. We know that. Some people have come to call that period from the late 70s on as neoliberalism. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the impact on the Black working class communities is devastating because, I think there's a story that's told, and I broach this in the book, that can be a little confusing. And the issue is, well, there was deindustrialization, which hurt the Black community. And in some places like Detroit, that's true. But in many places, Black people were never actually that integrated into the industrial economy. And that's, I think one of the most interesting notes about the so-called Great Migration and the way that's taught to us is this idea that, there were jobs in the North and Black people moved to the North to get these jobs. And it's certainly true that business in the North and the existence of Jim Crow in the South drove Black people north, but there was never any one-to-one job situation. So very quickly, you have large communities of Black people coming from the rural areas into these urban areas looking for work, many people unable to get it. In some places, and this is why you have high Black structural unemployment. As far well back into the 1930s, you look at sociology reports on this, and you see that even then, in the 40s. Things were a little bit better because of the war, but even then. So ultimately, you have these communities that are providing usually the lowest possible rungs of labor in these urban areas, with many more people clamoring for a small number of positions, crammed in, these tight areas, redlined into them. Even if you have a little bit of money, you can't get out of them. Heavily over-policed, underserviced in every possible way. And this ultimately becomes the roots of the urban uprisings in the 1960s. But ultimately, the response that comes in the mid-1960s is, by and large, a strategy of co-optation during the Johnson era and some of the local states, certainly New York State, New York City, Mayor John Lindsay, and certainly the country at large. You look at the 1967 Detroit uprising, and you see that immediately after that, the city fathers and the economic elites of Detroit come together and say that they're going to hire all these Black people, these young Black people. And it was by no means a perfect program, didn't touch the issue of seniority in the plants, but nevertheless, thousands and thousands of Black people got jobs in many of these industries because they were afraid of this uprising. And the promise that was being made to the Black community at this time, and even into some elements of the Nixon administration, it's not fully a story just of the story that's told the most and that's relevant is the brutal assault, but not the massive co-optation campaign. I suggest people read Black Awakening in Capitalist America by Robert Allen, which is from 1970, which lays this out. The promise that's being made is basically like, in the same way the Irish, Italians, Jews, whatever white ethnic group you want to choose, were integrated into the country. We're going to do the same for Blacks, the middle class lifestyle, the chicken in every pot, the whole American dream. Do hickey. We can make that work for y'all. Just don't rise up. But ultimately, whether that was ever true or even possible is another question. But it ends up being, I think, a non-factor, because what you see happen is the shift to this race to the bottom, to this global race to the bottom, and the shift to moving away and attacking American working class people to restore profit rates is, of course, also accompanied with an attempt to roll back government, because the idea, we talk about quote unquote government, but the idea of expansive government, really speaks to the government that does things. And usually an expansive government doing things is because people wanted to do good things. So in the context of, not just eliminating jobs, but also trying to roll back the role of the state in a way that favors working class people, these communities are then being completely destroyed. The few jobs that were there are being taken away, or, de-skilled even more, or pushed down in terms of a wage level. And, the social programs and other elements that can maybe ameliorate some of this begin to be ideological offensive. And this is very, again, it's all in my book, Shackled and Chained. But, the culture of poverty thesis, which, ultimately blames poor people for their own problems rather than admitting there's any fault in the system. So you end up with, by the beginning of the 80s, completely devastated, destroyed communities that are going to have much higher structural rates of unemployment and poverty, that have a long history of political insurgency and, explosive political insurgency that moves the country. So you've got a very heady brew of political problems, social issues that emerge, the fallout from this complete, utter devastation and destruction that, creates challenges in many communities faced with similar issues. And ultimately, what are you going to do? Like, you've already ruled out doing anything to solve these problems, because these problems are caused specifically by the things you are trying to do as a ruling elite in America to, get back to the top profitable spot. So the only other solution then, if you're not going to resolve a problem, is to try to contain it. That's why I always say the police and the prisons, it's sort of like holding a lid on a boiling pot to try to keep it from boiling over. The Reagan administration comes in, and by this time, you'd had agitation since the mid-'70s by Democrats and Republicans. People like Joe Biden, for instance, who played a big role in mainstreaming law and order politics for Democrats. You have Reagan come in as president, and you have the right brew kind of come together, that things like mandatory minimums, increased money for prisons. Right when the Reagan administration comes in, one of the very first reports the Justice Department does is on the issue of quote unquote crime. And the takeaway is the number one thing is we don't have enough prison beds. And I say in my book, it's kind of like the starting gun. And there's many more things that could be said from there, but that's basically what you get. It's a policy of social containment of the communities viewed to be the most potentially problematic for the ruling class in the context of the new, if you will, neoliberal dispensation of profit making that they want to set up. So that wasn't brief, but there it is.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We are talking with Eugene Puryear, who's the author of Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America, as well as a host of Breakthrough News. We are talking about the economic, social, and political factors that led up to what is commonly called the prison industrial complex. Anyway, I'd like to go back to this sort of intervention that makes sort of this mass incarceration period, I think, different than sort of, the period of slavery, which is simply primitive accumulation of capital, that U.S. society was essentially built on the fact that they had this free stolen labor. Whereas in this case, it's not a need for labor to sort of primitively accumulate, to sort of barbarically build this society from genocide up. But in fact, it's staving off to some degree a potential end for this cruel and unjust system.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that it's a barbaric way of dismantling society in a way. I mean, the contradictions mounting as they are. But yeah, I mean, I think that, to this day, the overwhelming number of people in prison are in, publicly run and owned and operated institutions. I think that, like every other public entity, more than most of them, prisons have been very much targeted on the privatization level. I think there's quite a bit of, highly opportunistic, vulture-like behavior to gain contracts for operating various elements internally to prisons, healthcare, food, the phone system and things like that, that I think is natural and inevitable. I mean, you create any large bureaucracy, the issue of contracts becomes a big issue. I think in terms of prison labor, what's the bigger issue? Yes. I mean, again, even now, there many people in prison work, but there's a lot of different elements to that, including, many states that have prison labor heavily restrict what sort of industries and things like that you can work in, because outside businesses do not want the competition. So, there could be it's limited the sort of economic role. It obviously is not the central role of the prison. Now, in the context of mass incarceration, the lobbies for these entities, the contractors, the private prison owners, the companies who outsource work into prisons, is much larger than it was at the beginning. And it's now a bigger factor in the issue of eliminating mass incarceration. So while I think it was not a major factor in the creation of mass incarceration, I do think that now, while we're trying to end mass incarceration, it's become a major hurdle in terms of pushing the issue forward, because the number of people profiteering off these 2 million people in prison, 7 million people, if you include those on parole and probation, has become so much more massive. You've got some moves that we've seen in some states to move towards direct competition, or allowing more direct competition between prison labor and outside labor. And I think as the contradictions of capital are intensifying, these are becoming more relevant in many ways, categories to the broader conversation. The one place I'd say that this is drastically different is immigration detention, where private prisons are the norm, not the outlier. So that is a very interesting fact. And certainly one thing people commented on at the time, when Trump was elected, one of the first things that happened is the stocks for these private prison companies started increasing quite a bit, because everyone knew that they were going to bring many, many more immigrants into detention. So, that's sort of a separate element that I think does deserve its own conversation as well in terms of how that works. So I think it's a mixed bag in terms of how the role, how we look at the role of these different elements. But I think you're correct. In the creation of mass incarceration, the main point really is the complete destruction of the Black community in this country deliberately, in the post-1960s period, the 1970s, as a concerted part of the broader strategy to restore capital to the level of profitability that capitalists found acceptable. Of course, they never were not profitable, but to the level they wanted to be. And I think that ultimately this process of containment and social control is the reality. I mean, when you look at, statistics for stop and frisk, they always happen in two types of areas: in oppressed communities where it's all Black and Latino people by and large, or in nice areas. And I always say it's about controlling space and place, letting you know the places you aren't welcome and letting you know in the places where you live who's really in control. And I think that ultimately when we look at policing and prisons in that context, everything else starts to make sense. But yes, I do think that the existence of this mass situation has created its own new incentives that have to be grappled with and have to be approached, because ultimately they become a significant material factor in terms of who's at the table and who's pushing back.
The same social, political, and economic crises that the capitalist state faced in that period of the 60s and 70s, those are still present in some form or another. The fundamental class relations are still there as they were 50 years ago, to a large degree. So given that, what is the state, I guess either the prison industrial complex or other related apparatuses of the capitalist state today? What should we be kind of keeping our eye on?
Well, I'd say the sad thing is it's basically unchanged from when I wrote the book. There's been a massive increase in agitation around and organizing of a fantastic type, including inside of prisons, which started before I wrote that book and has really intensified people on the inside organizing and fighting back. So I don't want to discount that in any way, shape, or form. I think it's fantastic. But I think the reality that we've seen is the state seems unwilling to make significant reforms in policing and prisons. And I think, to speak to your exact point, I just don't think that's an accident. We've also seen in this most recent period a big shift, and it was a smaller shift before this, but we've been seeing it increasingly since the Black Lives Matter movement erupted in 2014, shifts in the white population on this issue, and kind of, to greater and lesser degrees, but consistent across pretty much all values, even Republicans, whatever. And obviously, when you look at the politics of the country, you see more Republicans and other conservative people speaking out on these issues. Whether or not it's, however we denote that, whatever. I'm not trying to say it's great or anything. I'm just making a point about the issues itself and sort of the social weight. And I can't think of any other issue where there appears to be more support, but there's actually less movement than this. And to me, it feels that, again, to go back to your point, because the structural realities of capitalism are ultimately what's at play. There really is no one in the capitalist class in the political establishment that wants to address that, really, in a serious way. I mean, it's maybe a handful of people, but like when we really think about housing everyone, feeding everyone, giving people a decent life, giving everyone an education, just, flipping the script entirely on this, just completely decrepit, falling apart society that's killing as many of us as possible, it seems, on its way out and destroying the planet as well. They obviously just aren't going to do this. Like, outside of the issue of criminal justice, it's 100% against what we see. Like, who is in the political sphere that can actually change things right now? Is it the leadership of the Democrats in the Congress? Is it the leadership of the Republicans in Congress? Is it Trump in the White House? Is it the governors? Is it these neoliberal mayors? Like, who is it out there that's like, yeah, let's actually do this stuff? No one. They don't want to make sure that there's no income inequality. Forget that, or poverty at all, that no one's hungry, that, we have a society that values and treats people with respect and doesn't tolerate, the violation of people, in any way, in terms of how interpersonal relations take place. I mean, no, they're not trying to build that kind of society. So at the end of the day, what can they do? And I think that's where it leaves us now, is a recognition of what that really means. If there's no one who politically represents the views of doing the things that need to be done to make this world more just, then, we have to do more than vote. We have to do more than just participate in the system. We have to try to stop the system, disrupt it, and ultimately, I think, establish a new one. Because obviously, if things as basic as the cops just randomly shooting people for no reason is like off the table to stop, I mean, I don't know what legitimacy this government or system could possibly have.
What can people sort of gain? What should people be studying and looking at from Black August in terms of like what Black revolutionaries, what sort of lessons of that movement are most relevant to today and to this current political moment?
Many people remain incarcerated today, political prisoners, because they raise the exact same critiques of society that are being raised now. They raise them resolutely, intelligently, directly, and, sometimes with a lot of courage. And I think, sometimes people were framed. Sometimes people were sent up. Sometimes people weren't framed. And what they did is classified as a crime, but it really isn't. It's a political action that was done to further the liberation and the furtherance of humanity. And I think I've never heard of any liberation that's ever succeeded in history that doesn't lift up their political prisoners. Because, these are people who really, we look to, we revere, we talk about everyone. I love the Black Panthers, blah, blah, blah. Mutulu Shakur, Sundiata Acoli, Mamiya Abu-Jamal, Russell Maroon Shoatz, Sada Shakur in exile. I mean, we could go on and on. The people who they were those people who are always talked about and are still under the gun 100% now, and we need to fight for them and fight for their freedom. And I wanted to say that parenthetically because I really feel as much as we're elevating the struggle, we have to lift up the political prisoners. I mean, Palestine, Ireland, South Africa, it would be inconceivable not to. America, the only radical movement where, it can be a challenge to bring the political prisoners in. We have to change that. Thinking about Black August and taking the figures of Black August seriously theoretically is also important. I think whether we're talking about George Jackson, whether we're talking about Safia Bukhari, whoever we're talking about, I mean, many of these people have made, serious and real contributions to, you talk about, is this fascism in America? Interesting to me that those conversations seem to never involve any sort of dialogue with George Jackson, who obviously had very interesting thoughts and relevant and important to discuss about the issue of fascism in his own writings, especially in Blood in My Eye. So I say, that just to say that I think we have to not just like remember people as if this is some sort of, parade or whatever, but we have to, I think, try to learn from them in a serious way if we really want to be able to bring all the tools available to analyze our current moment and to act and to know what's going on.
We were joined for this segment by Eugene Puryear, who's the author of Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America, as well as the host of Breakthrough News. Thank you very much, Eugene, for returning to the show once again. It was really nice to hear from you.
Hey, right on. Thanks so much for having me.
You are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. Stay tuned. And now, once again, it is time for Tech for the People with Chris Garaffa. This is a regular segment that we've been doing about technology issues from a working class perspective. So, once again, we're talking with Chris Garaffa, who's a technologist based in New Haven, Connecticut. Thank you very much, Chris, for returning to the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on again. It's great to be back.
What story do you want to start with? We have several we can talk about.
Yeah, there's one from Kim Zetter in The Intercept that I thought was very interesting. As organizers and activists and progressive people, ourselves, and as we know, many people listening have been in the streets over the past few months in the movement for Black Lives, standing up against police terror. The Intercept has this great article explaining what Stingrays are. And of course, this isn't, the things in the water. This is something that police use to track cell phones and other mobile devices. And they can use them at protests. So the way your cell phone works, just the way cell technology works, is that you have to be, constantly pinging the towers to see which ones are near you. That's how you get service. That's how it shows you how many bars are going to be on your phone, how close you are to towers, how good the reception is. Well, these Stingrays are devices that pretend to be cell phone towers. And these can be handheld devices, they can be in a truck, but also they can now be in planes and helicopters and drones that fly above the ground. And they pretend to be a cell phone tower. And so when your phone can't really tell the difference. And so your phone says, hey, this is my phone number. Actually, it gives out something different called It's an identity number on your phone, the IMSI, and it sends that. And from there, you're supposed to get information from your carrier about, what kind of service you have and stuff like that. Well, turns out that the IMSI number is tied to your SIM card, and your phone provider knows what your SIM card is. It's a little chip inside your phone. And so they can identify you based on the IMSI number that the Stingray collects. And you generally will probably not know that this is even happening because the Stingrays and other devices like this will actually work kind of in the background. They'll just pass along your information to a legitimate cell tower, or they'll do it in a low power way so that your phone connects then to another tower, and you still get your messages. You get your text messages, your Slack, or email, Facebook, whatever it is. We know that the DEA has a number of these devices, a lot of them. The U.S. Marshal Service, the Secret Service also have these devices, and they have used them in the past. So this goes back to when the DEA and the Marshals were, basically given permission by the Justice Department to support law enforcement during the protests in the most recent uprising. It's still not entirely clear what they used, but it is in these memos that they asked for special authority from the Justice Department to spy on the Black Lives Matter protests. So what we can assess from that is that they most likely did use these Stingrays, whether it was handheld or in a truck or car or in a drone or small plane flying overhead. And again, what they could get from that is actually the cell phone information of everyone that was on the ground at any given time. That should be an absolute violation. And we should view this as an absolute violation of our rights. We have a First Amendment right to protest and to organize and to associate with each other. And we should not be tracked just because we are at a protest. And this has been something that we've seen from many law enforcement agencies in many cities across the country. This is not just something that the federal government has. In fact, local, state and local governments also have these devices across the country.
What can we expect as far as challenges to the legality of the use of these Stingrays, or is it pretty much at this point, does it seem to be so just reflexive on the part of these law enforcement agencies that there's very little chance that they'll give them up?
We have seen already the power that this movement has, where cities across the country are establishing civilian review boards or other reforms. Some, of course, better than others. Cities are moving money out of police departments and into public services. So we have to see that it is the movements that have the power here. One thing we should do is be aware of how to protect ourselves, too. We consider if you want to be using your phone at a protest. Most of us think, I'm going to need it, right? Because we need to be able to stay in touch with people. And that's a very legitimate concern. Like we do need to be able to stay in touch with the people we came with, that we're organizing with, to get updates. But if you're able to turn your phone off at a protest, that's actually not that bad of an idea, especially if there's, if you expect heavy police repression, either from federal, state, or local police forces. You don't know if they're using these devices, and you often won't find out until later when somebody does a FOIA request and forces it to go through. So consider whether you need to have your phone on you. At the very least, turn it off or leave it at home or somewhere safe, which is actually your best bet. We should mention the NSA actually put out a document a week or so ago where they give it's a public document with advice that they give to their own agents in it. But they did make this public. This isn't a leak. And one of the things they recommend is that if your location absolutely can't be given away, to leave your phones somewhere safe away from the location of what they call the mission. And they even say that a phone that has been compromised, you can't trust it even if it looks like it's off. Just because it looks like it's off doesn't mean that it's actually turned off, which is a very interesting thing. We know now that the NSA has the capacity to do this, and we've known that for some time. It was just very surprising to me to see this, this advice in a public document that they have released. So if we go back to the issue with the Stingrays and these other devices called dirt boxes, which is a specific kind of brand of Stingray, the safest thing to do, if you can't have your location associated at a protest, then leave your phones at home. Don't just turn on airplane mode and all of that. And of course, everyone has to find their own level of comfort, right? Everyone has a different situation. So I don't want to make everyone paranoid and say no one should ever have have a phone at a protest, but people should be considering the level of risk that they're willing to take.
Yeah, so I think that covers a lot of ground for our first story. Again, just sort of going over once again what the Stingray is all about, essentially understanding that law enforcement does indeed try to track any phones that are generally in the area of these protests, and sort of, generally the things one can do to safeguard yourself against that, again, like depending on your own level of risk, et cetera, like the things you need to do to generally safeguard yourself against that are important. And people can find Tech for the People, I believe, on Facebook and Twitter.
That's correct. Tech for the People on Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, let's turn to some of our other news stories. We have, I think, 4 additional ones to cover. Where do you want to go next?
Well, since we're talking about spying and all of that, let's go to this filthy hypocrisy of America's clean, China-free internet. This story by Sam Biddle had me kind of cracking up at the sheer ridiculousness of it. The State Department, and in particular Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, is pushing for what they call a, quote, clean internet. What that means, there's 6 components of this: clean carrier, clean apps, clean store, clean cloud, cable, and path. And so they actually want to just remove China from the entire internet in the United States. What they want to do is they want to get, first of all, you can't use a Chinese carrier in the US. You can't use a Huawei phone in the US. You can't purchase a phone and use it. So much for the free market, right? They want to prevent Huawei from doing any business in the United States. There's clean cable. Now, a lot of the internet is run through underwater cables. There's maps on the internet that you can actually look up and see all of these massive cables that are just run under the water on the ocean floor. And what they say is they want to prevent China from tapping into those. And we'll come back to that. And then there's clean apps. And of course, the app that everyone is thinking of right now is TikTok. The video sharing social media app that's really popular with young people right now, that Trump has said he's going to ban. The interesting thing about this with TikTok is that Trump said he was going to ban it after Microsoft said that they were interested in purchasing it from ByteDance, which is a company affiliated with China. Not the government of China necessarily, but the country based in China. And so Microsoft says they might be interested in buying TikTok. Trump says that he's going to cut off TikTok if they don't sell entirely to a U.S. company and cut off all contact and deals with China. So they've clearly put ByteDance in a very difficult situation here, where they have to either choose a one-time sale to a U.S. company, or they just get cut off entirely from the U.S. market. The idea, though, of a clean cable and a clean carrier is just absolutely ridiculous coming from the U.S. government. This is the same government that since at least the 90s has been doing mass spying on phone calls. And, we know that especially since 9/11 with the Patriot Act, has been spying on our emails and our social media and our web browsing and our text messages and all of these things. They talk about clean hardware, clean equipment, but we know that a number of years ago, there were through WikiLeaks, we found out that the U.S. government, the NSA, was basically intercepting shipments of network equipment from a company called Cisco, based in the U.S. Cisco makes giant network routers and systems that basically help to make the internet run. Intercepting them at their own labs and then shipping them back out to whoever the intended recipient was. These are mostly U.S. companies and internet service providers that are the recipients here. And they were putting specialized chips in them that you could barely detect. This is the NSA doing that. So, of course, the U.S. is saying that Huawei and the Chinese government are these massive, threats to democracy and whatnot, except it's the U.S. government, the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, the DEA, and so many other agencies that have actually been the ones spying on not just people in the United States, but across the world. So it is absolute hypocrisy to say we're going to have a clean internet. What it is just a China-free internet. It is it's a xenophobic internet, effectively, on the app and hardware side.
Let's move on to the next story here. The story that is titled "Google's Secret Home Security Superpower: Your Smart Speaker with its Always-On Mic." So, what's the rundown of this?
Sure. So there's a company used to be called Nest, and I believe they still market their products under Nest. They make thermostats and security cameras and stuff like that. Google bought them a number of years ago, and that's part of the reason why I'll never have one in my home. And Google also recently purchased the home security company ADT. You've probably seen, in many places, there's signs outside people's homes. Well, there was a Reddit user who last week got a notification on his phone while he was cooking dinner and set his smoke alarms off, which, who of us has not been making some sort of sausage or something and set off the smoke alarm? But he got a notification on his phone from his Google Home device that said smoke alarms going off. He had never actually hooked that up to have a Nest or Google smoke alarm. Turns out what happened was his Nest hardware, now owned by Google, detected that a smoke alarm was going off. What we've since found out from Google itself is that Nest devices are going to be able to detect things like smoke alarms or breaking glass, or other noises that they say can be concerning. They call them critical sounds, and they're bundling this into their Nest Aware home security subscription service. So that we have to go back to the nature of these always-on speakers, whether it's Siri or Alexa, Cortana, the Google setups. These things are always listening, right? And you have to say whatever the trigger word is. Hey, Siri, okay, Google, whatever it is. And then they continue to listen and respond to whatever you've told them, whether it's what's the weather or play a certain band or whatever it is. Well, they still have to always be listening to hear that trigger word that you've said. And now they're not just listening for those words, they can listen for other sounds. Again, smoke alarms, breaking glass, things like that. A big question here is, are they detecting this and analyzing it on the device itself, or are they detecting it in the cloud? That is to say, are they sending audio back to Google or Apple or Amazon to figure out if that was a smoke detector or something else, or are they doing it right on the device? We know in the past that prosecutors have actually subpoenaed Amazon for recordings from its devices and gotten them, and they've used them in trials. People, might not even know that, Amazon and other companies can keep records, unless you tell them explicitly not to, of the recordings from your device. So basically, I always say avoid having these things. The HomePod, the Nest, all the smart speakers, they're very cool. But I would avoid having them in my home. You never know when it's actually going to start listening to you, whether you wanted it to or not.
This penultimate one we have is from the Wall Street Journal. It's U.S. government contractor embedded software in apps to track phones. So what's what's the threat level here? What are we talking about?
Yeah, this is something that happens on a lot of apps, right? Someone called a developer will have a product called an SDK, and they'll either sell it to another app maker developer, or they'll actually offer money for an app developer to put these pieces of software in their own products. So let's say I'm developing an app. This company, Anomaly 6, could come to me and say, hey, we'll give you money to put this in your app, or we'll sell it to you because it's going to give you information about the users of your software. This happens all the time. You don't even know, every app on your phone practically has some sort of SDK with third-party analytics on it. Sometimes that's Facebook built in, sometimes it's Google, sometimes it's others. There are thousands of these companies. Well, the thing that's interesting about Anomaly 6 is that they're very closely tied with the U.S. government. They have not just private clients in the private sector, but the U.S. government is one of their clients, and their focus is actually location data. So they're collecting location data. They provide this on a global scale to various branches of the U.S. government. And they also provide it to private sector clients. Now, Anomaly 6 says that they don't share that information from the private sector SDKs with the government, but we have no way of knowing that. There is no proof to that whatsoever. There's no proof the government hasn't subpoenaed them and said, you have to provide this, or just even asked nicely and said, please provide this, and they've handed it over. There needs to be an absolute investigation into this. Location data is one of the most sensitive pieces of information about us. Ever since we started carrying cell phones in our pockets, we are giving away our data, not just to the cell phone company itself, which as we talked about earlier, they have to know where we are in order for our phones to work. Not just to the cell phone companies, but to the manufacturers of our phones and the apps that we're using. And, this shouldn't be a trade-off. It shouldn't be a trade-off that in order to use a phone, you have to send some random company in Virginia that has government ties the information about where you are.
Let's turn very briefly to our last story, which is about Twitter to begin labeling state-affiliated media outlets. Thank God our monopolistic tech companies are coming back to once again protect us from the wrong kind of information. That we're being attacked on all sides. I'm being entirely sarcastic here, by the way. We're being attacked on all sides by disinformation from Russia and China and Venezuela and Iran and every other state enemy. And here these private companies are to come in and tell us what is propaganda and what is truth. Thank God for these tech companies, right?
I actually saw this live on Twitter before I was reading anything about it. I follow Sputnik, I follow RT, I follow a whole lot of different news sources from around the world. Some that I like, some that I really don't, but just to see what's being covered. Russia Today, Sputnik, China Daily, and a number of others have these labels on them. They say China state-affiliated media, Russia state-affiliated media. I checked. Voice of America doesn't, even though it's literally run by the U.S. government. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty also don't. They are funded by the U.S. government. NPR, the BBC, Twitter actually says that they are state-financed media organizations with editorial independence. However, I'm fond of calling NPR National Pentagon Radio because that independence doesn't really exist. This is just more of this scare tactic, right, against Russia and China, Venezuela, and Iran. NPR Politics actually put out a post over the weekend saying that, I might be getting them backwards here, but, Russia is working for Trump. Iran is working for Biden. China is working for Biden. And then, Iran and Venezuela just want to see basically the whole thing burn. Which is, and there was no source, there was no, real information about it. They just quoted unnamed intelligence sources. And Twitter is playing its part in this nonsense, this extended Russiagate hypocrisy. By labeling Russian and Chinese and other state-affiliated media. But of course, Twitter isn't the only one who's done this. We've seen this on YouTube in the past when they labeled Telesur as actually funded by the South American government.
I think it was the Latin American government. I think it was just...
Yes, that's right. It was the Latin American government. And I said, I woke up and there was a Pan-Latin revolution overnight. That's great. No, this is not the first time. I think this is only going to increase. They want us to be, and by they, the corporate owners and backers of these politicians who are benefiting so much from this fear, want us to be terrified of Russia and China, but completely ignore the fact that, first of all, a small number of U.S. media outlet of companies in the U.S. own media outlets. audience. There are very few shows like yours, or the number of other podcasts and and radio shows that are out there where you can talk about things that we're talking about.
Those truly independent media outlets that are also really independent, sort of anti-imperialist or anti-war, anti-U.S. foreign policy, which is the most destructive foreign policy on planet Earth. All of those are becoming increasingly scarce because, those within the nonprofit sector are increasingly tied to grant funding coming from usually state-run sources and whatnot. The idea that the state doesn't have any sort of, doesn't exercise any sort of control over the editorial lines of whether it's quote unquote independent nonprofit outlets or whether it's the mainstream corporate stuff, and I'll include NPR in the mainstream corporate stuff. I mean, the US state absolutely plays a huge role in all that. I'm thinking, for instance, of the Russian bounty conspiracy theory, part of the larger Russiagate narrative, most of which has also been revealed to essentially be a baseless conspiracy theory. But the Russian bounty conspiracy theory that stated that the Russians were, supposedly paying the Taliban to place bounties on American soldiers' heads. This story came out right at a time when the U.S. was considering, was like within peace talks and trying to withdraw from from Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, this story comes out that supposedly Vladimir Putin, just out of pure evil, apparently, is paying the Taliban to to assassinate American soldiers. Never mind that this makes no sense on like just an empirical level, that like why would Russia pay why would Russia pay the Taliban to do something they're already doing? It doesn't offer any more incentive. Never mind like the logical inconsistencies with that. The only source for the entire story was anonymous US intelligence sources. Now, if China or if Russian media, if Chinese media, Russian media had put out a similar story about the US and their only source for the information was an unnamed number of people within their own state, that is to say, like Chinese or Russian intelligence sources who would not come on record, and they were promoting a story, and the media of those countries was reporting that story as absolute fact, that would be understood to be state-sponsored disinformation. That would be understood to be a state exercising its control over the editorial line of those media outlets. And yet that happens within the U.S. and it's just completely brushed off. NPR is always labeled quote unquote public media or whatnot, even though NPR presents, just as a random example, presents the far right-wing Atlantic Council, which is funded by, among other groups, NATO, literal Ukrainian Nazis fund the Atlantic Council. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf state monarchies fund the Atlantic Council. So the Atlantic Council on NPR is always presented as this neutral think tank that's just there to present like this neutral, matter-of-fact, objective analysis, when in fact they have a far right-wing agenda. The Atlantic Council also exercises control to some degree in Facebook, where Facebook has partnered with the Atlantic Council to determine what is and what is not quote unquote disinformation. And so anything that points out, for instance, that Ukraine is run by literal Nazis, swastika bearing, SS flag waving, Nazis who are committing pogroms against Jews, Roma, and Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. Anyone who points that out is considered disinformation. Is considered like quote-unquote Russian disinformation by, again, the Atlantic Council. So like all of this is to say that, if you're going to talk about state-sponsored disinformation, if you are so worried as a social media company about state-sponsored disinformation, you can look no further than to your own shores, than to your own corporate media apparatuses. Anyway, to a large degree, I think the theme today in many ways is hypocrisy. This sort of like the through the looking glass element to like when the U.S. is all of a sudden concerned about disinformation and a quote unquote clean internet, whatever the case is, absolute hypocrisy at every level, I think. Anyway, any sort of last thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, real quick, I'll just say this is hypocrisy, and I'm glad we are, able to expose it. Again, I just want to reiterate to people, let's not be paranoid. Let's be aware of what the state can do, but let's not let the state do its job and keep us out of the streets and out of the movements and away from talking to people about the justice that we need to be fighting for on so many levels, not just in the movement for Black lives, but that is the primary struggle right now. So let's stay out there organizing and just be smart about the way we're doing it.
Yeah, without a doubt. And once again, the idea is never to make people paranoid and to get people, to drive people away, but just for people to understand what it is that's going on, so they have better tools available, so that they have a better analysis available of what it is, what the global situation is, what their own personal situation is, and sort of, again, like what these, the law enforcement and other repressive and surveillance apparatuses are up to. Anyway, I think that's a great place to go ahead and wrap up. We were joined for this segment once again by Chris Garaffa, who's a technologist based in New Haven, Connecticut. Thank you very much, Chris, for coming back on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.